Thank you for joining today's Fiber Broadband Association webinar titled Visualizing Success in RDOF, Part 1 of 2, Where to Bid, being presented by Vetro FiberMap, CostQuest Associates, and Quadra Partners. My name is Doug Weinbaum, and I'm the Senior Operations Coordinator for FBA. Before we begin, I'm going to briefly go over a few logistical items. Please keep in mind all participants are in listen mode only. To ask a question during the presentation, please type them into the question box located within the control panel. We will host a Q&A session towards the end of today's presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to members on FBA's website within 24 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Webinars drop-down option. The presentation slides, along with another resource, can be found in the handout section of your control panel. And at the conclusion of the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief online survey. We appreciate your feedback. So at this time, I'll pass it over to Stephen to begin today's presentation.
Hey, thanks so much, Doug and FBA for the partnership, and a big thank you to everybody on the line for joining us. We know that you're very busy during the day, so we appreciate you carving out the time. Just a few quick slides for me to kick us off here. So, RDOF is a once-in-a-decade opportunity. I'm sure many of you recognize that, given that you're taking the time out of your day to be here. But it is a race, right? The preparation starts now. And that's a critical takeaway from today's presentation. Really want to make sure that there's a sense of urgency because there's lots to do, a lot of ground to cover, and the time to do that is now. The FCC timeline is pretty tight, so we're going to show you some of those, some of the ways that you can accelerate your preparation today. Key learning objectives is really to identify the immediate steps to start your auction preparation if you haven't already, and if you have, or regardless if you have, we really want to outline some critical tasks to develop your strategy, and hopefully that adds some key components to your analysis going forward. So a quick agenda, right? We're going to walk through an RDOF tutorial, so some background about the auction, how we got here, and what are some key moving parts that you need to really look at. We're going to dig into preparation, including where you start with location data and looking at your business cases in various areas, how a mapping platform can really help speed up your analysis and help visualize some of these elements, as well as an outline for the next steps with a little bit more detail. And like Doug mentioned, we'll wrap up with Q&A. So today's speakers, we have John Wilkins from Quadra Partners, former FCC COO. We have Jim Stegman and Mike Wilson from CostQuest Associates. We have Will Mitchell from Vetro FiberMap. Why are we here? The three of our companies, right? Really, we provide different pieces of expertise that are all important in the auction and preparation process. Quadra has a tremendous amount of expertise in auction strategy. We at CQA really, hang our hat on financial modeling and location data. And Vetro, has this wonderful platform for mapping and network design that helps visualize a lot of our data, but also, some other key components that make it useful in your processes. With that, I'd love to pass it to John Wilkins, who is our first speaker, and he can kick it off for us. John?
Hey, thank you. John Wilkins here. So we've got a set of slides here to go through RDOF. Looking at the registered or the registration list of companies, I think there's going to be a range of knowledge and experience here. What I'm going to try to do is two things. For those of you that are a bit newer to RDOF, I'm going to make sure I hit the basics, make sure you've got a clear view of how this process works, what the timeline is. For those of you that had a bit more exposure to RDOF already, I'm also going to try to hit a few of the more advanced topics, especially as it relates to bidding strategy and some of the more advanced strategies. That said, we're going to scratch the surface here. So when we're done, people have follow-up questions. We're certainly glad to do that. Before I flip my slide, let me just say one introductory note. The time to prepare for RDOF is now. I would actually say the time to prepare for RDOF is yesterday. As many of the folks listening know, preparations for RDOF has been going on for a while. There are many companies out there that are already working with CostQuest, with us, with Vetro, with others to prepare. So, you don't have a moment to waste given the timeline that we're on and the complexity of the issues. Okay. Next slide, Stephen, if you could flip it for me. Okay, just a couple headline messages. So once in a decade opportunity. To be really clear, what we mean by that, the funds that are going to be awarded in the RDOF process, they are substantial. It's actually the most funds the FCC has ever awarded at one time, but it is a 10-year award. So for areas that are RDOF eligible now, if they are of interest to you, if you pass, if you don't pursue it now, there won't be another chance for 10 years, and even after that, it's unclear there will be additional funding available. So you really do have a once in a decade, you got to decide now if you're going to go after these funds. The FCC is also on a very fast timeline. I'll show you the schedule in a minute, but the auction starts in October. The filing date to enter the auction is coming up this summer, and you don't have time to waste. For those of you that are a little bit more experienced with other FCC auctions, this is just one of a series of auctions the FCC has run to award funds like this. The most recent one was called the CAF2 auction that was 2018. RDOF is similar at a high level, but there are actually a lot of very important differences. I'll touch on one or two of them. But just because you were in CAF2 or maybe you are working with folks that know CAF2, not a guarantee that you're going to have RDOF right, because there are some important differences. As I said, you should actually probably be preparing already, but if not, now is the time to start. And then one last thing I'm going to say at the end, especially for smaller entities that are a bit newer to this process, there's a mechanism called bidding consortiums that essentially creates a much easier way to participate, especially if you're not already an experienced company that has done this before. And I'll talk about that a bit at the end. Okay, here are the topics we're going to cover. This is the capsule summary of RDOF. We'll talk about the funding amount and the timing. We'll talk about what do you have to do if you get the funding. We'll go into eligible areas, and that's just a critical topic. I'm going to lay out the basics, and then we'll talk more about it over the rest of the webinar today. I'll give you an overview of how the reverse auction process works. It will be only the very simple version, and I will just mention a few of the more advanced bidding strategy topics, but that's a much longer discussion if you really want to master the auction strategy, and then I'll give you the overview of bidding consortium. Okay, here are the funding amounts. So on the left, we're showing the RDOF process. In total, RDOF has been sized by the FCC to be $20.4 billion in total. That's over 10 years. And it's in two phases. So first, the blue on the left-hand side, that's the phase one RDOF auction. That's what we're talking about now. That's this year. That is going to be up to $16 billion of awards. Areas eligible all over the country, and it's scheduled to happen in October. Phase two at the moment is sized at around $4.5 billion. That'll be a few years from now. We won't talk about that today, not enough time, but it's an important second part of the process. Just for context, on the right-hand side, we're showing CAF2. So that was the last similar process the FCC ran in 2018. That ended up awarding $1.5 billion. So less than 10% the size of RDOF. The FCC viewed that, though, as a successful, let's say, final dry run of this process before going to these huge amounts that are going to be true on RDOF. Here's the timeline, and this is a very fast track. So end of January this year, the FCC finalized the rules. At the end of February, the FCC released sort of the important companion item, which is the procedures for the auction, right? So the rules are the high level, the strategy, the funding amounts, the eligible areas. The procedures are the details of how the auction works, which is actually pretty important. In March, the areas that are proposed to be eligible released, those lists are out. CostQuest has mastered all of that data, and anybody that's interested that hasn't looked already should be looking at those eligible areas to see if there are areas that are eligible that you're interested in. The next big items, likely later this month, the FCC will then finalize those procedures that came out in February. There'll be a lot of very important details there. Also, likely later this month, or maybe a little bit later into the summer, the true final list of areas eligible will be released by the FCC. And then that's it. The FCC is then locked and loaded for this process. The deadline to file for the auction, which is called the short form application, is likely going to be late July. Again, that final date has not been announced. It probably will be announced this month. but given that October 22nd has been announced by the chairman of the FCC as the start date, if you work backwards from the usual FCC timelines, your short form deadline is going to be late July, early August. And to be clear, that is your real deadline. If you do not file either yourself or as part of a bidding consortium an application at the short form window, you cannot participate. So you've got a little bit less than 3 months now probably to make your decision. Here is what the funding tranches look like and what you have to do, okay? So first, just to kind of go from the top of the slide to the bottom, here's the rough timeline. So if we look in the far left-hand side of the slide there, let's say the auction starts October of this year and it's gonna end, probably December of this year, maybe January of 2021. A good chunk of 2021 then will be taken up by the FCC reviewing the final applications of the winners. The FCC asks for a lot more documentation of your plans before they start giving you money. It'll probably take less than a year, but just to keep the timeline simple, let's say that that's most of 2021. If you win funds, essentially what you then start getting is, let's say January 1st of 2022, you get the first 10% of your money, and you get that every year for 10 years. What do you have to do for that money? Well, in areas that you win, the FCC will have a number of locations, residences, small businesses, end user locations that today do not have broadband, and that if you take the funds, you are agreeing to build broadband connectivity to those locations. And what you have to basically do is build out to 40% of them by the end of the 3rd year, and then 20% a year thereafter. So by the end of year 6, you've built out to all the locations. And so yes, you're expected to build more quickly than the funding flows. Depending on your business case, that may or may not require some financing, but that's the deal. In one sense, that's all you have to do though. Unlike other kinds of government programs, you are not required to submit auditable, cost accounting. They don't really care exactly what you're doing with the money as long as you're building to the locations. A few other things you have to do. Recipients of RDOF funds do have to become what's called an eligible telecommunication carrier. That's a state regulatory classification. What does it mean to serve a location? Well, the standard in the FCC rules is that if a customer at that location requests service, you can provision within 10 business days. So it's not that you have to necessarily build a drop to every location in advance, but you have to build a network that can be provisioned within 10 days. If you start to miss these obligations, the initial implications aren't that bad. If you miss by a little bit, say your first deadline, you might have to certify or submit certified information more frequently. If you start missing by more, the FCC will be concerned and will look for money back. And in particular, that's the last big requirement. If you win funds, you have to have a letter of credit, an irrevocable letter of credit that the FCC ultimately could use as a fallback to recover funds if you do not build as you said you would. And I'll show you in a second what that looks like. High level ETC, this is essentially required by federal law that these funds can only go to eligible telecommunication carriers. Very simple summary is that over the years, these obligations have become less burdensome than they might have been in the past. What I will say is if you're going to be in the broadband business, a lot of what you will be doing anyway will be part of your ETC obligations. There are a few things to keep in mind, though. We don't have time to go into them now, but fundamentally, these are state filings, and many winners of past universal service funds have done this without too much problem, but it is something you have to do. Last point at the bottom, just in case this is an area where you're a little bit concerned about exactly how you're going to meet those obligations, you do have flexibility under FCC rules to essentially work with other kinds of providers. It's not that if you win funds, you and only you have to do every last bit of it. There's some details there that are important, but there are some creative structures that can be used to manage certain risks. Here's the letter of credit. The blue at the bottom is the amount of credit you have to, is the size of the letter of credit you're required to have. Basically, here's how it works. When you start in year 1, your letter of credit has to be equal to essentially that first year's funding, right? So the FCC gives you the first 10%. It requires you to have a letter of credit equal to that 10% that kind of matches the outlay of the public money. Now, if you remember the 2 slides ago, though, technically you're not committing to actually build anything for 3 years. That's the first deadline. So the FCC is concerned that they give you 3 years of money and ultimately something goes wrong and they can't get it back. So the size of the letter of credit has to increase over the first couple of years of the build. So in the second year, it goes up to 15% of your total amount. In the third year, it goes up to 20%. Now, at that end of that third year, if you successfully meet your first deadline of the 40% build out, the FCC then basically says, okay, we're now confident you're going to be a good citizen here. We will let you drop the letter of credit amount back down to the original 10%. That will then persist through the rest of your build. And then when your build is done and we've certified it, obviously the letter of credit can go away. Conversely, if you miss deadlines though, the amount ratchets up. And folks involved in the financing side of this will tell you these letter of credits, they are somewhat expensive. And so the better you can do at meeting your obligations to keep the amount low, the better you're going to be. One last quick thing, there is an optional deadline for letter of credit purposes only. If at the end of 2 years you've already built out to 20%, that's not required for your overall obligations, but for letter of credit purposes, if you hit that, you're allowed to drop your letter of credit back down immediately to the 10% level. Okay, now let's go to eligible areas. Two most important things here are the 2 words in red. When you think about geographies for RDOF, the critical thing is to remember there are 2 different things we're talking about. The first one is, what is the unit at which you actually bid? Like in the auction, are you bidding on a town, on a market definition? What is it? The current proposal is that it is a census block group, which is a reasonably small, but not the smallest census unit. But the actual way that funding is made available and the way it is sized is based on an even smaller unit, which is the census block itself. That's the smallest census unit that exists. Now, that may not seem obviously intuitive to you. Let me show you in the next slide a picture that'll hopefully clarify it a bit. So here's a very simplified example. Okay, the big rectangle here, the overall one, so let's just say that's a census block group, census block 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's what you actually bid on in the auction. Let's say that census block group is comprised of 4 individual census blocks, A, B, C, and D. Now, let's say that the black dots are locations that are deemed by the FCC to not be served with broadband, and the red dots are. So let's say this is some small rural town. You might have an incumbent telecom operator or maybe a cable operator that's offering broadband just in the town, but not on the outskirts of the town and not out in the agricultural areas around it. Okay, so let's just look at census block A. There are only black dots in census block A. No broadband is available in that census block to any location. That is the eligibility criteria for RDOF. So census block A is eligible if the FCC was to determine, for example, that the initial amount of funding needed for census block A was, let's just say, $250. That's what goes into census block A. Census block B has 1 red dot there, right? The town line, technically cuts into census block B. There is 1 location there with broadband. That would not be eligible for RDOF phase 1. By the way, that is what RDOF phase 2 is going to be in a few years. Census block C, of course, not eligible. That's where most of the town is. And then census block D, no red dots. It is eligible, and it's got $300 in funding available. So with that list of census blocks and that eligibility and amounts in the census blocks, the overall census block group would essentially begin the auction with the bidding at $550. The winner of that census block group would have to provide service not to the whole census block group, but only to the locations in census block A and census block D. Okay, that's a much, much longer discussion in the real world, and that's something CostQuest is an expert in, but I'll just leave it there for now because that's the fundamental way eligibility works. Now, lastly, let's just talk briefly about what a reverse auction is. Some of you already are very familiar with this, but if you're not, basic idea of a reverse auction is the FCC says, we've actually done some modeling. Actually, CostQuest did the modeling for the FCC to be accurate. And let's just say that the FCC believes that in this eligible area, we think the necessary subsidy to provide broadband everywhere is $1 million. The auction basically says, okay, we're going to offer $1 million. Who wants to provide broadband to everyone in this area for $1 million? And the telco may say yes, a wireless provider, a satellite provider, whatnot. And the FCC says, okay, great. Well, how about $9 million? How about $8 million, right? And so the auction basically goes down until the auction ends and there's a provider per area. You know, there's a lot more to how the way the auction rolls out than that, of course, but that's the basic idea. You're sort of going downwards to figure out, you know, what's the least subsidy that at least one provider will meet the obligations for. What this means, of course, is that whatever your opening funding is at the beginning of the auction, it's going to be less than that at the end in all likelihood. This is what CAF2 looked like. The auction bidding in the areas that won money actually began at $5 billion. The final awards were $1.5 billion. Now, that does not mean that we're guaranteed to, you know, go down by that much in RDOF. You know, RDOF will have entirely different dynamics, but your ultimate award will be less than where it starts in all likelihood. Now, you may be asking, how does it work if you've got different kinds of networks? You've got a fiber to the home bidder, you have a wireless bidder, a satellite bidder. Those have very different costs. Basically, the FCC uses a weighting system that this slide describes that essentially, you know, gives you kind of more credit, if you will, in a given bidding round if you're building a faster network. You know, again, not enough time to go into all the details of how this works now, but just suffice to say that the FCC does have a methodology that tries to balance out, in a sense, the difference between less expensive service that might be cheaper to provide but not as powerful versus more expensive services that might provide the best service, and the auction methodology balances those out. What that then means in practice, I go to the next slide here. Okay, so here's what this means in practice. Those weights on the previous slide. In the real world of the auction, it translates into a view like this. So let's say that the gold is a fiber to the home bidder. The blue is a fixed wireless bidder. The auction proceeds over the rounds there at the bottom, and on the left is basically effectively the amount of money that the different kinds of networks are actually bidding on. The weights adjust so that, for example, in the round that the dark arrow is describing, round 13, you know, the same bid, in other words, the auction sort of says, okay, this is an equivalent bid in the way that we're evaluating who's going to win, is actually worth a lot more money to the fiber bidder than to the wireless bidder, right? So if the wireless bidder was to win here, they would win essentially half as much as the fiber bidder would win. And that's essentially how the auction methodology works. It tries to sort of balance out the different costs in a reasonable way to make the money go the furthest and have the most broadband be delivered. If possible, the best broadband, but if not, at least good broadband. Now, one thing I want to really emphasize is trying to predict where this process ends is somewhere between challenging to impossible. And the most important driver of the amount of money you're going to win is really going to be, when does the auction end, okay? Even if you are the only bidder in a geography that you care about, that doesn't mean you just win the full amount at the beginning. Whatever you win actually depends on when does the auction end. And this is a view from CAF2 that shows how did we sort of try to project where the auction was going to end. The orange line shows the actual round by round bidding. The red line essentially shows the end stage condition for the auction, like the amount of money actually available. And the blue shows what a projection would have been. So what this is essentially saying is, let's say even in the middle of the CAF2 auction, you were tracking along. By round 11, you would have said, hey, it looks like we've got a couple more rounds to go here. The blue line kind of projects out at least to round 13. What actually happened in CAF2 is that between round 11 and round 12, things just fell off a cliff in terms of the way the bidding was working, and the auction ended. There's a lot more to it than we have time to do now, but just suffice to say, if somebody tells you they know when the auction is going to end, or they know how much money you're going to win, just ask them, really, you know, were you able to predict where CAF2 ended by round 11, let alone what RDOF is going to look like at the end? Last thing I just want to point out here, and this is a more advanced topic, there's been a lot of discussion about in the RDOF rules as opposed to the CAF2 rules, there's a more favorable set of bidding procedures for the fastest network. So, right, this is the fiber to the home networks are favored to win. So that's true as a general statement. But the most important thing is it is not true that fiber always wins in the last round of the auction. If you actually read the current rules, what they say is the fiber bidder, the lowest weight, the fastest network will win if there's a tie, right? So that's what scenario 1 here shows. If in the final round, those are the bids, yes, the fiber optic, the 1,000 megabit, the gigabit bidder there in red would win. In CAF 2, they would have had to keep bidding, and that's an important difference. But if you look at scenario 2, under the current rules, that's the last round of the auction. Just because there's a fiber bidder there doesn't mean they win, because their bid was higher than the 50 megabit tier bidder, okay? Now, as the experts listening here will know, the final approach here is still under consideration by the FCC, so we'll see. But this is very, very important to your bidding strategy. Like really understanding how do you win and under what conditions do you win is the essence of bidding strategy. And it's not quite as simple as just having the fastest network at the end means I win. Okay, that was the super quick nutshell. Hopefully, as I was tracking along, you could see these areas are the kind of things that you really have to have a lot of knowledge in. You know, of course, the very large companies, Frontier and AT&T and CenturyLink, you know, they're experts in this. They're the kind of companies that already know how to do all this. For other kinds of bidders, though, you may have gaps here. One question is, how do you sort of close your gaps here so that you really can be able to compete effectively with more sophisticated bidders? One way to do that is what's called a bidding consortium, or bidding consortium, plural is consortia. Essentially, this is an exception to the FCC rules that prevent bidders from coordinating if you file as one group. Most importantly, if you file as one group, you can do the things that this slide described. You can share experts. There are streamlined ways to enter the auction. And in particular, if necessary, you can coordinate on bidding. Let me leave it there. There's obviously a much deeper set of things to prepare for the auction, and that's what we're going to turn to now. And I'm going to turn it back over to Mike Wilson to do that part of the discussion.
Thanks, John. Before we go into my presentation on opportunity assessment, if participants could take a quick poll here on how likely is your organization to bid in RDOF. I'll give you a little bit to respond to that, and that's helpful for when we develop and finish our content on episode 2. We'll have something to go on. And from what I can tell, early results are nearly 30% are very likely, roughly a quarter, somewhat likely. So a lot. That's the answer to that. So let's move on to the next slides and talk about opportunity assessment. So in my presentation, in the interest of time, we're pushing a lot of the detail on opportunity assessment to what we're calling episode 2, part 2, episode 2, which Stephen was calling the Clone Wars yesterday. I hope not. That was a terrible movie. But we're reserving a lot of the detail on opportunity assessment, the full business case, to part 2 of this session. So next slide, we're just going to talk about the bullet points of an opportunity assessment. So essentially, you need to prepare, and we're using athletic competition visual metaphors here, but clearly understand from John's presentation that this is a competition across geographies, across ISPs, across technologies. So you need to prepare. You need to learn the rules, which John talked about. Auction rules, there's obligations. We'll talk more about that in the next episode. You need to understand the competition, who's likely to bid. You need to know what it is you need to be made whole in your numbers, in your business case, and you need to put it all together for a lively auction day. Next slide. So essentially, the bullets here are going to be learning the rules. I would say that a lot of this is a sanity check. You first need to understand what the reserves are in the areas that you might bid in. That's maybe your current service areas or edging out. You need to understand the locations in those areas, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on locations and why that's important. It's critical that you understand the total number of eligible locations and where they are. That's helpful, very helpful. And you need to understand your obligations, your federal obligations, your state ETC obligations. Having gone through this with my old company, which was the first wireless ETC more than 15 years ago, it is a fundamental change to how you do things. I think it was a very positive change for us, and it helped us bring our services to rural areas better. But you do need to understand what you're getting yourself into, and do consider either doing a deep dive yourself, a very deep dive, or leaning on some experts. The next slide. So really sizing up the competition. Really, you need to know who's likely to bid. So you need to know what competitors, what ISPs are in the area that you're interested in. What's their geographic proximity? How are they going to extend their networks to those census block groups where there are eligible areas? What are their costs, right? What are their costs relative to yours? What are their costs relative to others to bring those services to those areas? We'll, again, talk about this in greater detail. And you heard John talk about the performance tiers and the weight. You need to understand the competitive landscape and who those competitors are. What do they typically deploy in last mile rural areas? And you need to estimate where they're going to fall on the performance tiers, because those weights are heavy, very heavy. And the results should give you an idea of who's out there, what's the landscape look like in competition, and what is the likelihood of bids coming from those performance tiers in a CBG you are interested in. That's critical for you to understand. The next step, moving on to a little bit more about your own enterprise in the next slide, you need to understand your own numbers, right? You need to measure in geographic terms what's your proximity to the eligible census block groups. And part of that exercise is understanding what your appetite is for edging out from your current network footprint. How aggressive are you going to be? Well, that really depends on what's out there in terms of eligible areas. So proximity is important. Cost to deploy, you need to understand your investment, but you also need to understand your operations and maintenance costs over time. Those are huge in rural areas especially. This is a 10-year program. You need to look at your O&M over that amount of time at least, maybe even up to 30 years. And your operations and maintenance, your OpEx should be not just net ops, network OpEx, it should be G&A, customer service, advertising, everything that goes into running that business, that component of the business that's serving these ETC customers. And you don't just want to look at costs, right? We're looking at wanting to understand a business case. So you need to do a true opportunity assessment of that area, including getting to a net present value, right? And that is going to take demand. What is the demand? What's your take rate expected to be? And what are the revenues associated with that take rate with those subscribers? Not just subscriber revenue, maybe ancillary revenue, et cetera. And so we need to bring revenue into the model and get you to a point where you understand basically the commercial viability if you didn't have subsidies, so that you know what your bids are going to look like and what your bidding strategy is going to be. In the next slide, putting it all together is critical. You need to compare your costs to the competition's costs. You need to see yourself in juxtaposition to the others who might bid in that area. Are you likely to be in a better position or not such a great position? Again, the performance tiers, speed and latency are critical. The bidding weights are heavy, and you need to compare your bidding weight to the competition's bidding weight. And then you need to score and prioritize this in a way that helps you compete for those auction CBGs when auction day comes. And the last slide, really what it should look like is a stacked rank of census block groups prioritized in a logical way using very sound data. Prioritizing on good, accurate location data is going to be the differentiator for you. When you look at estimates of locations, the FCC is putting out, those are based on 2010 census estimates. They want you to build the actual locations, and by year 8, you've got to do that. So if you understand where the actual locations are, that may put you in a better position in juxtaposition to your competition when you go into the bid day. So that's very important. And the work you do in this assessment needs to lead to something that you can use on auction day. Example would be the ability to adjust your data as the auction clock runs down. So you know how that changes as time goes on, right? It's critical that when the auction ends, that's when you know potentially what you're going to receive. Again, critical information to put into your business case is location data, and Jim Stegman is going to walk us through that. Jim, why don't you walk us through that really quick?
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for the lead-in. So now that you on the phone have an understanding of the rules from John and kind of that checklist that Mike talked through, I'll walk you through how we're helping some of our clients work through just some of the first steps of putting together their business case, what they need to look at, and as Mike mentioned, understanding the locations you need to build to, and that to us is critical. So the first part of where you need to start and how we start with our clients is, one, get all the FCC information you can. The FCC has released the census blocks or the preliminary census block groups that are available for bid, which census blocks are eligible within those census block groups. They've released the RDOF order. I would encourage you to read that, understand it, and understand the obligations that you'll be made to meet. Then once you have that in hand, you need to pick the area that you want to kind of look at. I'm not saying you hone in exactly on the census block groups that you're going to do, but look at the area to understand what's available and what you'll need to build to. And as you do that, understand what locations you're going to have to build to. The FCC just gives you a broad count. It doesn't give you the specific latitude and longitudes of those locations that you're going to need to build to, which are critical to pull together your business case. And that's really what I want to touch upon in the couple slides that follow here. You really need to pull together your cost estimates that lead to your business case, that help to come up with your targeted bid ranges, and to pull together your competitive analysis. You need that accurate location data to avoid the pitfalls that may befall you, as you may not understand exactly where you need to build to if you don't have that accurate location data. And what is that accurate location data? And I'm going to present ours here. There are other data sets out there. There are address data sets and other vendors out there, but ours is what we call the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. It is an aggregation of hundreds of millions, if not billions, of data points where we've applied statistical scoring and managed crowdsourcing to identify the rooftop location of virtually every broadband structure in the country. And to us, this is the key component of why we believe the data is useful, in that it helps you understand where you need to build to provide this broadband service that the FCC is funding you for. So let me just give you a quick run through of what this broadband serviceable location data looks like and how it's built. What you're seeing here on the screen is an image of an area. The light green boundaries that you see are the parcel boundaries. So we grab parcel boundaries. In those parcel boundaries, we then grab a tax assessor information that tells us about the land use of that parcel. We also will grab other tax assessor information that may tell us how many buildings are on the parcel, what's the square footage, and other key attributes about the parcel. We then bring in building structure data. So we work with a third-party vendor who has digitized and provided us the polygons of every building footprint in the country. And from those footprints, we can now start through a process in which we look on that parcel and try and identify which of those building structures we believe is the point at which you would need to deliver broadband service to. And what you're seeing in this image here are those locations. So we've eliminated the outbuildings, the barns, the garages, and really identified the rooftop location of where you would have to run service to, which then helps you understand the drop cost, the networking cost, and all the costs that you will incur in building out this area. So part of that location data really comes into play when you look at the FCC data. The FCC data gives you the shapefile of the census block group. They tell you there's 395 locations in this block group that you see here. In that block group, they tell you the reserve that's available, $400,000. And that's all they provide. They don't tell you where. So where do you have to build in this area? And basically, if we overlay locational information, we now see and understand what we need to build to and how many locations are actually in there. The FCC number is a number that's a little bit dated, and they've recognized that they may update that in the near future. We believe our 378 count here is a good representation of the number of rooftop locations that you're going to have to build to. One other key aspect of this image is as you download the FCC data, they do provide shapefiles of the census block group and the blocks underneath. Actually, in this block group, there are 61 eligible census blocks. If you look at this image, you're not necessarily seeing the 61. The other thing you'll notice is that there are certain census blocks in which we identify there's actually no location that you can build to. So it's just important that you have this good data to, one, develop the cost, two, identify your optimal network design, three, identify any proximity of your existing network, and four, to help understand the revenue estimates by bringing in potentially demographics of the area as well. So where do you start? Once you have that proximity or the locational information, well, one, you identify the service footprint, and you can, from that, you can identify what census block groups that you will touch or that you encompass with your service footprint that you've drawn. From that, you can then start to set your strategy. Do I just want to build out in my service footprint? Do I want to edge out to other areas? That's a key part of the strategy that you need to understand, in part trying to make sure that you thwart some competitor who may come in and take part of your service footprint. So you just need to understand that. Two, you need to put together those estimates of what potential funding is available. As John hit upon, the bucket will start off quite large and then it will start to come down in each competitive round. You need to know where you're starting at and where you can end so that you understand when you need to leave the auction or how long you can stay in the auction alternatively. In this view, and we'll cover this in more detail in part 2 of this seminar, we go through a kind of a high estimate of any census block group that you've touched with kind of the boundary you've drawn to those that are fully encompassed by your service footprint. So we go from a high estimate of 25 million down to a low estimate of 1.5, so a broad variation. And this is really where you need to understand and know the data and understand and know how you're going to build out, because there's a quite wide variation based upon where you're going to build to. And then finally, you put together that business case. That business case will take the information of where you know the locations are. It'll take that we potentially know in this area, I may be able to touch 69,000 locations. Based upon demographics, the competitive overlay, I may estimate that I could get about a 40% market share of those customers to get to my total subscribers of 25,000. From that, I can estimate what my capital spend will be. How much money will I have to spend in this area to understand my potential line of credit and what I will need to borrow or raise in equity. I can then look at potentially my contribution margin. In this business case, which is potentially an outlier, I can make money in this area without any FCC contribution through the RDOF funds. But this is key, understanding what that business case looks like, as Mike said, to understand how much funding you need to make that business case whole. So how can we help, or how can your partners help you? One, help you get vetted locations, understand where the coordinates are that you need to build to. Two, develop good cost and investment data so that you understand what you're committing to and what money you'll have to have on hand to build out that footprint. Three, understand the RDOF estimates and what is your strategy for bidding. How far out do I want to bid on how many census block groups? 4, look at a competitive analysis to understand who's going to bid in my area and what may they bid. And finally, as you're looking at this, you need to plan, design, and operate that network should you win. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Will, who will discuss the planning, design, and operation of the network.
Thanks, Jim. Wow, a lot of great content here so far. I'm going to see if I can go quickly through the final section here about Vetro Fiber Map. There we go. Just introducing Vetro at a high level here. It is a fiber management platform, a mapping system, a GIS, and it's built to do this sort of workflow continuum, plan, design, and operate, as Jim mentioned. And we're really here talking today about planning. The second webinar in this two-part series will get more into design and operate use cases, but we're talking planning and how to evaluate available funding in your footprint or in an area of interest. We will touch on design here quickly as well. How do you start to get into actual network design for detailed costing? And then we'll save operations for a later date. So planning at the highest level, there's been a lot of talk about census blocks and census block groups. Here's a map of the eligible blocks for RDOF in a dark red nationwide. So this is an interactive mapping system, Vetro is, and you're able to kind of take this on at different scales, you know, starting at the bird's eye view here on the screen. Taking it down to the next level of zoom or detail, you begin to see the block groups, the bidding units, as they and the blocks they contain. So you're starting to see the relational context of the eligible footprints in the blocks contained by the bidding units in the block groups. That's the yellow highlight on the screen as a block group. And going right down to the ground level, here you're seeing the delineation of a given block. Again, no points in here, so it's just the outline of the area where funding might be available for a given particular census block with detailed mapping underneath. But that detail is important, in particular as we get into adding the context of locations. As Jim was explaining, what you're seeing here is the CostQuest location fabric data. The blue dots on the map, those dots that are in the red polygons are the actual locations that need to be served by an RDOF winning bidder in this particular area. And you're seeing lots of different views of maps, and there's a terrain view, lots of flexibility in the Vetro environment to evaluate these things. Taking it back up a notch, before you get down into the detail of the location, you heard some talk about evaluating available funding near me or in my footprint. We've been working with CostQuest for years and years, and we actually put a tool out for the CAF2 auction. This is a picture of a derivative of that, where a particular interested party could draw an outline of an area that they operate in or that they're interested in, and in a matter of seconds get a summary of available funding. The orange is my area of study. The blue highlighted areas on the map are the block groups, in this case from CAF2, but same model. Underneath the purple would be the blocks for funding. So we'll be swapping this out for RDOF geographies to do the same sort of at a glance analysis of funding near me. And quickly getting through into some more detailed work in the Vetro platform and the Vetro environment, you can analyze an aggregate of data from blocks. That's what you're seeing here. There's an orange outline of a block group, summarizing on the left in very small print all of the data in the blocks underneath that block group. So you can get a blanket view, not just an RDOF view. And you can carry that same type of analysis down to a more granular, more detailed level at an ad hoc geography, such that you're summarizing route center lines and getting route mile driven cost analysis for anywhere in the country in a matter of a few moments. So it's surface level analysis. You can see here, there's some settings you can choose within the platform. We've had these in here for a long time. We call it macro costing, back of the napkin math on route miles in any geography of your choosing. You apply a cost per mile, some take rate estimates and so forth, and you don't get a business case CostQuest style. That's much more robust, but for an exploratory tool, this is quite convenient for a quick look. Speaking of evaluating competition, other things you can do are layer in existing networks, in this case fiber networks coming in from a third-party service, fiber locator, but you can introduce other mapping of competitive overlays. You can also introduce mapping of funding overlays. So this is showing CAF2 award-winning blocks in purple relative to the red blocks, which are the RDOF eligible blocks. So it's a jigsaw puzzle. I love geography puzzles, and this is a great one. They nest together cleanly because they really targeted the same areas of the country, and where CAF2 funding went, RDOF funding will not go, but it's sort of finishing the job in a sense, so they nest together. And then importantly, in Vetro, you're getting now into the actual network. And this is where we really start to add capability and value. And this is just a quick shot of a little fiber network showing its adjacency to eligible funding areas. So you can start to consider at a asset level, can I get there? What would it cost me to reach those territories, et cetera? Quickly taking you into the next level, the topic being design. Now that you've got a sense of areas that could be of interest, you want to get down to a design level cost. So we give you all the tools you need to digitize and do a design, get to a design level cost. Very targeted on fiber constraints and constructs here. So it's a controlled digitizing environment. You can also introduce design automation. This is actually a picture of modeling generated by CostQuest in their cost on the way to their cost estimation and business case. They actually generate an automated design that can be brought to life in Vetro for huge time savings. In either case, you can apply materials and labor costs, and I'm going to quickly keep going through here to get to a design level cost estimate. And now this is something that you can hang your hat on. It's based on engineering criteria and actual network assets and design. Okay, quickly now, now that the auction's in the rearview mirror, you've won your funding. You're moving into design and construction of the network that's been subsidized and funded here. And all the rest of these bullets are just terms used to describe Vetro. It's a database of record, it's an asset management platform, a network documentation and inventory tool, it's a fiber management system. And you get all the way into the operational use cases, which again, we will touch on June 9th in the second webinar. But you're managing your connectivity down to the splice detail and circuit level of detail. And this is where Vetro lives on as an operational asset management system for network operations. We carry you through. I think it's important here to note that you can get into this one mapping platform, starting at that bird's eye view, getting all the way through the process and down to management of your splicing and connectivity, which provides a huge kind of efficiency gain by sort of staying in a unified platform and working through the process. So more on that in our second webinar. Thank you very much, everybody. Stephen, I'm back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Will. So we got a little bit of time here for some questions. So this is the more detailed auction prep steps slide. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this, but definitely check, grab the slides from the handout section and dig into this if you'd like. It's a nice summation of everything we've talked about, or some of what we talked about today. So we're going to move into Q&A. Since we have about 6 minutes here, I would encourage everyone in the audience to just type in your question in chat now. And we're definitely not going to get to all of them, but we'll certainly loop back with you all at the end to answer some of that. Also, for those of you with smartphones out, if you open up your camera section here, it should be able to get you into the registration for part 2. We'll also send an email follow-up there to link to that. So jumping into questions. So We have one here that says the aggregate reserve price for the 6 million homes is 29 billion. The clock rounds get you down to 16 billion. John, maybe you should take this one. If 1 million of the homes are challenged, and now the total is 5 million homes, what happens to both the 29 billion reserve and the 16 billion funding for phase 1?
Yeah, so well, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with the challenges. But yes, if the FCC was to grant some of those challenges, and the final eligible areas list that comes out soon has fewer homes, then yes, the reserve would go down below that 29 billion. I guess one thing just to keep in mind, right? There's a whole first part of the auction where what happens is whole areas will drop out. So in other words, it's not the case that just because the reserve's at 30 and the amount of funding is 16, that the most you're ever going to win is half, right? You could still win very close to the reserve, or a good chunk of the reserve, because the whole first part of the auction essentially would be areas that are just fundamentally too expensive to build, essentially get no bidders in some of the early rounds, and that's one way that the clearing is reached. So the final reserve amount will depend on what the final eligible areas is. That'll depend on what challenges are granted by the FCC. It'll start with the reserve somewhere in the $20 billion, and the question of how quickly you get to the 16 billion it's the $1 billion question. When does the clearing round get triggered?
That's great. We have one question here from Lee. I am a New York broadband grant recipient. The blocks that were awarded are included in RDOF maps. Do I need to apply for these to avoid competition in these census blocks?
Well,
Jamie, you want to grab
this
that?
is John. I could just jump in with one observation of, in general, that's always an important thing to think about here with RDOF. I mean, there's the offense version of this. Do I want to get RDOF funding to build, and maybe I have some concerns about the obligations or whatnot. But you got to think about defense too. And so if you don't get it, somebody else probably will, or at least could will. And therefore, even if you have your own business case without government support, competing with a subsidized new competitor obviously would be bad for other reasons. So you got to think about offense and defense. But if you have an area that is currently showing RDOF eligibility, make sure you check the final list. And certainly the idea of pursuing RDOF for defensive reasons is going to be one very important reason that some people participate.
Hey, John, this is Jim. There's some other questions related to that. When did the challenge process start and end? Is it over already?
Yeah, the official comment window, I think, was middle of April. The FCC, you can always kind of try to do things outside the formal comment window with with other filings, but essentially the challenge window is now ended. I mean, it started pretty quickly after the eligible areas list came out in March. And the FCC staff now is obviously just reviewing all those challenges, because the clock really is ticking. I mean, they need to get the eligible areas list out before the short form, because obviously, if I was a bidder, I'd want to be sure I knew exactly what was eligible before I threw my hat into the ring. So they are under a lot of time pressure to get it finalized. But I would say most challenges that are going to be considered have been in the FCC's hands now for a while, and they're just working through and really doing their own assessment of which ones should be granted.
Great. Will, there's a quick one here for you. Can you talk a little bit about how the sort of structure works for Vetro with respect to any folks interested in signing up, or how that might work?
Oh, sure. I would recommend just reaching out directly to us, vetrofibermap.com, so we can get into any detail on that. But it's a SaaS platform, it's a cloud native hosted mapping GIS platform for fiber network design and management. We can spin you up and get you access in a day.
Great. Let's see, we have one for Jim here. If we have proof that the FCC census maps are incorrect, that there are no services in a block group that the FCC says is covered, how can we appeal the FCC determination? Particularly after the pandemic, we know where homes are that are not served.
Yeah, I think John hit upon part of that. Is the challenge process is complete. And John, I don't know if there's any further appeals that can be made, but as of now, the appeal process or the challenge process is completed.
Yeah, I mean, look, people in the FCC process, I mean, you could always file something and see. I'm just saying that from a practical standpoint, right, the staff is under a lot of time pressure to get these things finalized, and they've already gotten a big volume. The other thing to just remember is, broadly speaking, the FCC set out a pretty clear expectation that challenges for this round, they wanted it to be a kind of a simpler review. I mean, the essence of round one of RDOF, or phase one of RDOF, they chose areas that, in the FCC's view, it should be more straightforward whether or not they're eligible, essentially because of the 477 filings that are made. It's phase two that they expect it to be, a much more kind of complex process based on actual locations, and that's all the new requirements that Congress has now enacted, that FCC has to base awards on actual locations, but that really kicks in for the second round. So, long way of saying, I think what most people following the FCC kind of expect here is that these challenges, I mean, a challenge that was based on, say, a carrier filing with the FCC and saying, look, these are areas that were just not in our June 19 477 filing, but they are going to be in our next one, therefore you should exclude them. That's the kind of thing the FCC will probably grant, because that's pretty straightforward. I think a lot of the more kind of intricate challenges about, well, actually, this isn't exactly right, I think the FCC is going to have a pretty strong bias towards just sticking with basically what it's said already in terms of eligibility, letting the chips fall, and in kind of round two of RDOF is where they're going to get much more into the the real bottom-up detail of locations in individual areas. I may be wrong, but I think that's a reasonable expectation.
That's great. So we're a couple minutes over here. Folks, type in any last questions, and we'll be referred to be sure to definitely loop back with you. Thank you all for the time. I'm going to turn it back to Doug for any closing remarks here.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you to all the panelists for presenting an excellent webinar this afternoon, and thank you to everyone who attended. The recording and presentation slides will be available to members on FBA's website. Our next webinar is scheduled for next Tuesday, May 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern, titled Multi-Vendor Collaboration, Bringing Best-of-Breed Technologies Together. And we hope you all can join us for that webinar as well. If you have any questions or comments regarding today's presentation, feel free to email the email addresses on the screen or membership@fiberbroadband.org. Thank you again for joining us today. This concludes the presentation.